Hello, welcome. It's really good to have this opportunity to be together with you. I'm Suzanne Lawson, as you can see from the little note on the bottom of my picture there, and I'm a parishioner at St. Peter's, Coburg, and have hung around the diocese and the national church and the international church for a fairly long time. So I'm excited about the discussions we'll have tonight. We have with us Bishop Andrew Asbill, Bishop Kevin Robertson, and Bishop Riscylla Shaw. And I would ask, Andrew, if you would please begin with prayer.
Be my honor. Thank you, Suzanne. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Good and gracious God, we thank you for calling us to be the church, especially in this time of disruption and change and uncertainty. We give you thanks for the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. We give you thanks and praise for the primates of the Anglican Communion, for all of the bishops, priests, deacons, and laity around the world in 165 countries that express Christianity in your way through the Anglican tradition. Be with us now, loving God, as we remember the conference of Lambeth and our opportunity to be together as a communion and the gifts of being a people spread around the world. Be with us, guide us, open our hearts and minds in this conversation, that we may be the communion you are calling us to be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a good setting of the tone for the broader feel. I was thinking that most of us spend the bulk of our time in parishes or in a parish. And this will be a chance to have you help us see beyond that parish tonight as we deal with some questions about the Lambeth Conference that you're all not just back from, but recently back from. And I imagine an experience that you really enjoy. So tonight, folks, what we're going to do is I've got some beginning questions to start off with, and to have, if the chat line doesn't go wild, but we would really like to hear your questions, some of which will fit into some of the topics that I have handy, but others will open our eyes to some new possibilities. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them on the chat line, and we'll try to get to most of them. That's what we'll do. Our plan is to end in 90 minutes or before if we run out of steam. And but I'm going to start out with something that I think may be helpful. I think it's important that we as Anglicans in our parishes in the Diocese of Toronto, or wherever we are at the moment, understand ourselves to be part of a bigger whole tonight. And what holds that whole together, that's WHOLE, by the way, what holds the whole of the communion together is what are called the 4 instruments of communion. Interestingly enough, they used to be called the instruments of unity. But when it became obvious that unity was not where we were, the word was changed to communion and is far more relevant to today. So actually, Andrew, your prayer did a good job of doing that, but I'll repeat them. The first instrument of communion is the Archbishop of Canterbury. I always remember Rowan Williams saying, "I'm an instrument of communion all by myself." But it is, as we've watched during the funeral for the late Queen, it is very much the Archbishop of Canterbury who brings together the communion in that role and becomes an instrument of the making of the communion. The second instrument of communion is the one we'll focus on tonight, the Lambeth Conference, which is made up of all the bishops that in the communion that the Archbishop invites. The third is the group that I belong to, the Anglican Consultative Council, a much smaller group than all those people who wear purple gathered together in their best, but representatives from each of what's called the provinces of the Anglican Communion. And it's made up of bishops, priests, and deacons, and lay people. It's the only instrument that includes lay people. I will say now, and I'll probably say it again, it's also the only instrument that can actually, by its rules, make decisions. The Consultative Council decides which country is in the communion and which is not. And then the fourth is a recently formed group of people, and that's the meeting of the primates. And that's again at the call of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But all these instruments are times for prayer and reflection and discussion. But tonight it's the one with our bishops and these people who have represented us and represented the whole of the communion at the same time together. So let's get you going, folks. Make you talk. What is it? What did you find the conference to be? What's its purpose really, as you experienced it, rather than what I just said is written down? Anybody? Kevin, you look as though you're ready.
Sure. I'm happy to jump in and get us going on that question. I'm glad you asked what it was for me, because I think you've done a good job of talking about what it is theoretically. And
Yeah.
I'd rather talk about what the experience was personally and being there on the ground for those 12 days. I said to somebody about halfway through the conference that we had a very, very full agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the Lambeth calls tonight and some of the other pieces, the Bible studies and worship. But one of the things I said to another bishop about halfway through the conference is that if we pushed all that aside and all we did was spend 12 days getting to know each other, building relationships with one another, and praying together, that alone would be really a good use of our time. I walked away from the conference thinking that the relationships that were built, or I knew some bishops, of course, before I arrived. So the relationships that were deepened in those cases, it was really worth its weight in gold. That was really the essence of the conference for me, was being in relationship, which is not surprising. I mean, as Christians, we're relational people. We gather in community. We gather around a table. We gather together to study the Bible. All the things that we did at the conference as well. So that was really
Good.
my day to day for me.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. The other two of you, anything to add to that, or has Kevin spoken for you? Riscylla?
Oh, absolutely. Lots to add. For me, it was about the communion coming together in unity. And we were missing Rwanda, Nigeria, and Uganda, but they were spoken of fondly and prayed for. And as an aside, they actually were present at the World Council of Churches. So they're still at the table. It's a powerful symbol and an important thing. But it's about unity for me. Being at Lambeth, it was about being able to see across the globe, across the planet, this on some levels a sea of purple, but the notion that we share in solidarity our sense of call and our sense of responding to the call and our faithfulness to the call in the way of coming together like this. It was also for me quite a lot about worship, the deepening of being able to experience Christ through music from different parts of the world and through worshiping side by side with people who speak different languages and have a different approach, but are Anglican or Episcopal or however we speak of Church of England. Our unifying factors were really strong, and it was a really powerful experience. And it wouldn't do to finish without saying we ate together, we broke bread together. And that was a principal part of the gathering, morning, noon, and night, and snacks in between. But the notion of being able to sit with different people from across the globe, or with people who are near and dear to us, near neighbors from Canada or from countries that we're close to. So it was a really good experience of breaking bread together as well.
Great. And you have to have the English tea at the right time.
Oh, yeah.
Always.
The only thing that I'll add to that first question is it's a little like going to Frosh Week at university, and you really are living the university life. Everybody is living in this very intense community on campus, and you're meeting people consistently and constantly, and the rich diversity of culture and language and people, all with dressed differently, beautifully, casually, formally, and a real sense of graciousness as you meet one another. And sometimes you introduce yourself at least 2 or 3 times before you really sit down and have a good conversation. The opportunity to sit together in prayer, but also to sit down in front of somebody who you've not met before at a dinner table, and to extend a hand of welcome and hospitality, and to be able to ask about where they are and what it's been like for them coming through COVID, or what it's like in their context, is rich, just rich.
That's it. You've just reminded me. Did you find people who did not speak English, by the way, and came with their translators? I mean, that's a surprise to most of us lay people, that there are members of the communion who are bishops, who speak not a word of English.
Absolutely.
The translator booths were really important at Lambeth.
Yeah.
And we had a translator in our small group in Bible study who was continually translating as we went, which creates a different cadence of communion, and really meeting each other and being tender and open to a different way of communicating. It was wonderful.
So we had headsets, and there were translator booths lining the sides of the plenary hall so that we could all be sort of together in understanding. And it was not an easy process. It was clearly very intentional and far-reaching.
Yeah, that's great. I've often been thinking of how valuable Michael Pearce was when he was there because of his capacity to speak 5 languages.
Exactly.
Could really move around, but it's hard for the rest of us. I wanted to ask, and you began this, Riscylla, by saying that there were 3 provinces missing. Is that correct? Yeah. My question was, who got invited and who didn't? Were they invited?
Absolutely.
And so they declined the invitation.
Yes.
Yeah. The other that did not come as well was Sydney, the Diocese of Sydney in Australia. They were missing as well.
Yeah. Dear. And then I gather, Kevin, that your husband Mohan was not invited among the spouses,
right?
But came to be with you anyway, and
that's right.
That's great.
So as as Riscylla said, there were certainly people who were invited who didn't come, and I think we need to. I'm glad that Riscylla said that. I think we also need to be mindful of the people who were just not invited, and in some cases they came. My spouse was an example of that. And in other cases, they didn't, just because they weren't made to feel welcome. And as we talk about unity and communion and our desire to be in communion, I think we always need to be mindful of the people who have not been invited to the table. I think that's, I think that's really important. My spouse did come, and I was so grateful to him for coming. He came a few days after I arrived, and he left a few days before I left in order to be home with our kids. But it was wonderful to have him there. And one of the things that I said when I was interviewed when I came back with the Anglican Journal is that the infamous Lambeth exclusion that people talk about, it was a pretty inclusive exclusion. When Mohan got there, he was there for 6 days, I guess, maybe 7 days. And it was full the whole time. Because even though he and the other same-sex spouses were not invited to be part of the spousal conference, and he wasn't permitted into that fellowship, they were granted observer status. So they hung out in the plenary hall and sat in the observers gallery. They were invited to worship, to the opening and closing Eucharist. Mohen was invited to the Old Palace for the dinner that everybody was invited to, or over the course of the 6 or 7 nights. He was invited to come to London the day that we all went together. So he was very busy, and he was excluded, but felt quite included in lots of ways as well. And the University of Kent was absolutely marvelous. The day that he arrived, he wasn't permitted to stay in the residences with the rest of us because he wasn't registered, and that was true of the other same-sex spouses as well. But he came in, and there was this wonderful basket of wine and fruit and chocolate on his bed, and it was in the note attached to it was from the students and staff and administration of the university. And they basically said, we know that you haven't been welcome to the conference, but you are absolutely welcome to the university. We're glad you're here. We're delighted that you've decided to come, which was just a wonderful sign of Christian hospitality, perhaps from an unlikely place.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So let's go back to, how did you prepare for this? How was preparation done before you got there? How?
Well, each of us was invited to be a part of a small group that met ahead of Lambeth, that began on some of the themes that we were going to be talking about, like the environment, the Anglican unity and identity, and also reading material that would set us to prepare us for studying 1 Peter. Was really the opportunity with the missing of going in 2020. They really took advantage of those 2 years between to kind of get us going. Originally, they were thinking of just regional meetings, but most of our meetings were quite international, which then gave you a leg up in meeting some folks in person after having had some close encounters online.
Oh, that's great. And have those people remained special friends or over the time, or did you then just move out and that gave you the courage to move into other relationships with friends?
We did reconvene in those groups early on in the conference. We all had lunch together in our pre-Lambeth groups. So it was amazing because the pre-Lambeth work obviously all happened by Zoom. And suddenly we were all sitting around picnic tables together on the grass, seeing people face to face that we'd only come to know through Zoom through the winter and spring. So that was a great experience and I think, Suzanne, in response to your question, those did, for at least in our group, those were deeper and enduring friendships. I'm still in touch with some of those bishops since the Lambeth Conference. So yeah, I think that was a really good way of setting the tone for what we were going to be doing together.
Yeah. And that's picking up Riscylla's comment about, and you ate together. You were around those picnic tables. Good stuff. Riscylla, yeah. I butted in. It's your turn.
No problem at all. And, we all answer the question differently. I just brought carry-on luggage. That's how I prepared for it. A backpack and a carry-on because I didn't want to lose my luggage.
There were people that did lose luggage, I guess.
Yeah, we did. We had one Canadian bishop who lost his luggage and wound up buying a new Rosh and Shamir while he was there, so that he was not alone. There were others who never were reacquainted with their luggage. Sadly.
That aside, which is a little tidbit piece, but there was a lot of prayer actually, and sort of a notion of grounding for me before I went in the question of how did I prepare to go. I had a good conversation with my spiritual director who had been to Lambeth before, and just spoke with a number of different people who have had experiences of international gatherings of that size. And it was a very interesting dynamic because a good piece of advice that I got in preparing to go was take a look and see what's going on, and then look and see what else is going on below the surface. And so that was a really great experience. And I know for a fact that it will take me some time to continue to process what did I see below the surface. But it was a good preparation to sort of come up with that filter with which to look at things, and to have a sense of always remember that there's way more going on than what meets the eye.
Mm-hmm. What good advice. My goodness. That's great. Well, Andrew, in your description of what we were going to do tonight, you said that the Lambeth Conference is to pull together people for prayer, for reflection, for dialogue, and for building community. And I thought it might be worthwhile just to catch a couple of you on each of those topics about the sort of memorable times that you are thinking of. When you think of the times when you met for prayer, what is there one that stands out for you? Riscylla, do you want to start? You're smiling.
Yeah. For me, a very particular time stands out, and that's when Archbishop Justin and his wife Carolyn met with the Indigenous peoples of Canada and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and there were some of our South American compatriots there as well. And there was a time of gathering, intentional gathering and prayer and conversation that was very, it felt quite intimate in a very appropriate way, that we were getting the attention of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so that was very beautiful, and it was very meaningful.
Did you see the impact of his recent visit to Canada as he gathered with the whole Indigenous crowd?
Indeed. And Bishop Isaiah Larry Beardy brought a pair of moccasins for him with a turtle embroidered or beaded onto it. And I caught a great picture of him wearing his moccasins the next day for the presentation in the morning. So it was very significant. And he actually spoke of his trip. He mentioned it once that he'd been to Canada. And then more recently with the horrible incident in Prince Albert and just outside at the James Smith Cree Reserve, he made mention of that again in his prayers. And so we're deeply grateful for the resonance that experience, that trip has had for him. And we know we've been affirmed that it meant a lot to him and that he's paying attention to Canada in a good way. So, yes.
We need all the help we can get in terms of our reconciliation and healing work. And if he's understanding that hard work that we all have to do and helping us, that's great. That's good. Another one, was there a highlight in the prayers, the praying part together that one of you wants to say? Kevin, you're ready.
I think for me, it was the fact that our small Bible study groups met 7 or 8 times over the course of the conference. They were small groups. We had 8 bishops in my small group, and we met in very small rooms. So, and maybe at some point in time tonight, we'll talk about how Lambeth was something of a super spreader event for COVID. Some people were masked, some people were not, and a number of people left with COVID, unfortunately. But some of the events took place outside, but our Bible study groups were inside, and many of us made the decision to move them outside because the weather was beautiful and it was a good way to avoid getting COVID. The relationships that were built, Suzanne, in those groups, at least in our group, and the praying together was really powerful. In my group of 8, we had 2 bishops from England, 1 from Ireland, 1 from Canada, 1 from the US, 1 from Malawi, 1 from South Africa, and 1 from India. Unlike Bishop Andrew's group, we didn't need translation, so the conversation had a different cadence to it. But the praying together, especially across cultural and theological lines, and the trust that was built over those 10 days in our group, we keep in touch through a WhatsApp group. And that's another thing. I hardly ever used WhatsApp before the Lambeth Conference, and now like everything was happening by WhatsApp at the conference. That's how people stayed in touch with each other. But in my small group, that process of building relationships, building trust, praying together each time we met after we delved into 1 Peter, that was a memorable group for me.
It sounds like both in the prayer significance and in the reflection on what you were studying together and the cultures. Yeah. Let's move to times of reflection with people you met. Andrew, do you want to start us off with a significant memory that you have when you were reflecting on an issue or a topic or COVID or something?
Oh, there are so many to kind of lean on, but I think going back to Kevin's example of the small group, coming from very different cultures and circumstances and approaches to theology, what I found really meaningful was how quickly we reached a candor that was built on a hunger for being together and a real need to be in each other's presence and a real want to be present and to listen carefully to each other's context and to support each other in prayer. When I think of one of the bishops from Madagascar who talks about in his community that 1% of the population is Christian, and 99% is Muslim, and how persecuted they are as a church, and how risky it is to express your Christian faith openly, and how difficult it is to find housing, how difficult it is to find a job, how difficult it is when you are expressing your Christian faith in that kind of context. And for most of us who come from the West or the North, are confronted with that kind of experience, and that we take our expressing of our Christian faith just for granted. But to be able to sit in that context, and to listen to Bishop Michael talk powerfully about the kind of witness he does every day, and the risks that he has to take every day, was for me a real eye opener, and an invitation to draw closer. And as Kevin has also said, we started a WhatsApp group as well, and we stay in touch with each other, and we find ourselves praying consistently.
On WhatsApp?
On WhatsApp, yeah, little prayers, asking for prayers and support, and staying in touch.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, we'll talk a little more about the dialogue when we get to a discussion about the calls. And can I remind people that I can't actually easily see whether we've got some questions coming in, but we sure would appreciate some. But in the meantime, we'll keep on going. Am I missing something that the others of you are seeing, or no? Okay. But I think when we get to a discussion about the calls, we'll see about our highlights in dialogue. But talk about building big community. You're talking about the small group community. When was an experience when you built the big community and noticed it?
Suzanne, just before we jump into that, there are some, I've just flipped to the comments page, and there are some questions that people have posed in the chat room as well that we may want to pick up as well.
Okay. Oh, I found them. Thank you. But let's work on the one that I asked about in terms of the bigger community. Anybody? You'll
Ask
see
the question again about community and the larger community. Is that your question? Yeah. Well, for me personally, it was through the smaller group relationships and the individual one-on-one conversations that we were able to build the larger community that started to feel like a World Wide Web. It was really good, like little spots along the way of connection built the larger structure of a global community. So it felt very positive on that level.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the moments for me that will always be poignant, and we'll talk more, as you said, about the calls, but there was a moment in the calls around human dignity when I saw the Archbishop of Canterbury being an instrument of unity, in being able to be very frank with the church in describing where we are on the question of human sexuality, and recognizing that we are, and the communion is, in very different places. And I don't remember the words that he used literally, but he basically said, "I'm not going to sanction anybody. I'm not going to have anybody out. Nobody is on the outside." And that was a very big shift from the way that we have expressed that sense of who we are as a communion in the past. And I felt on the one hand relief, and also a deep sense of hope that we were actually going to leave the conference different than when we arrived. And you could feel, at least from where I was sitting, a sense of being in it together.
Something else.
That's a great question,
Stella
Suzanne.
first, and then
May I
Kevin.
just weigh in about the question as well, about a community of communities? Because I think, I don't know about everybody else, but I felt like I was part of a number of small communities when I got there and through the conference. I mean, there's the small community of LGBTQ bishops who had been meeting online for a couple of years, and suddenly we were all together in one place. I really felt a strong sense of the community of Canadian bishops and spouses. And we gathered once, but we were also connected by WhatsApp, and we were seeing each other informally. And I was so proud of our primate and our Canadian delegation. Like, the Canadians, we're a relatively small house of bishops compared to lots of other provinces. But I loved seeing the presence and the leadership of the Canadian House. Right near the end of the conference, Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, there were a group of us standing around, and he said something about, I see the Anglican Church of Canada as the designated driver of the communion, which I love that line, making sure people are safe, making sure everybody gets home safely. I think, I mean, he was joking, but I think there's some truth to that. I think the Anglican Church of Canada, and perhaps the Canadian House of Bishops at Lambeth, was seen as a not quiet, but a calm, reassuring, even wise group of people. And I think we have something of a reputation about that in the communion, and I think that's something to be proud of.
Oh, that's great news. I have a sense that we may have said, "I'm sorry," when we didn't do the driving very well. But Riscylla, you were going to add to that the sense of community.
Well, I wanted to add actually to what Bishop Andrew said about reflecting on Archbishop Justin's comments about not sanctioning people. Something else that he said that demonstrated his actions as an instrument of unity in the communion was that he firmly believed and held to and holds to the notion that people on all sides of difference do proper theological reflection and careful study on the subjects, whatever the subjects might be that bring difference. And there was a real sense of acknowledging that people are not being flip in their decisions. People aren't, choosing lightly. They are really being faithful in their way of seeing God's word alive and active in their lives and in the lives of their dioceses and their communities. So that was a really powerful statement that he made.
That was the one that really moved me the most, I have to say, having lived through the fractious years of the Anglican Consultative Council, when there was really the belief that we didn't count because we didn't know how to do theology, and vice versa, I would have to say. What's the matter? Don't you get it? And he, I thought that will remain one of his finest hours, that talk. Thank you for raising that one. I actually want to, before I get to a couple of the questions, I want to have this discussion about the calls, because we're talking about it and somebody needs to explain to me how many calls there were and what were they and how did they get developed. And then we can go.
I have a list.
Oh, we don't want but anyway.
It's a good list.
Okay.
It's a good list. There was a call on, I'm going to go for it. Environment and sustainable development, reconciliation, mission and evangelism, discipleship, interfaith relations, Christian unity, human dignity, science, and faith. And I'm pretty sure that's it. Did I miss
So,
one?
so
No.
tell me with that list, tell us what call capital C meant and how it was used in the process. Andrew, do you want to pick that one up?
Sure. They're themes for the future and the present. They are a call for the church to respond to the needs of the world and where we engage with the world. And they're not pieces of legislation. They're not synodical decisions. They are a focus for us in the direction and how we will respond as an Anglican communion in the world, how we do mission and evangelism, how we regard Anglican identity and understand ourselves. And the process, and I'd love to hear from Riscylla and Kevin about the process, because on the one hand, on the other hand, we were seeing these documents for the first time only days before the conference. So Kevin can certainly talk about being swept up in one of those calls as it was leaked out into the press, but it wasn't really clear for us as bishops how we were going to decide or give affirmation for the calls, because all of us are so used to synodical proceedings where we spend so much time wordsmithing. So if you can imagine 650 bishops from around the world trying to wordsmith a call, we wouldn't be given enough time. And in each case, we only had a couple of hours for each call. And we were starting with clickers like we're so used to in our own diocese, and those got tossed to the side. Then we try to do a show of hands or say silence or say yes or no, and that was tossed to the side. And really the organic calling of the assembled community of bishops really came down to saying, we're not voting on any of these. We are going to receive them, and each call will go forward into the future with smaller groups working on the feedback, because we were given the opportunity to give feedback, and then on to the Anglican Consultative Council to take them from there.
And Riscylla, you're on that. So you've got the responsibility coming your way.
Indeed.
Sounds like a big one. Anything you want to add about what Andrew has said about the importance of the calls to the process?
Yeah, I feel like it helped streamline our conversations. It helped us have some sense of collaboration in the conversations together, because we actually brought them to the same Bible study groups that we also spoke with. And so we had built relationship through Bible studies, and then we built relationship again through having conversations around the calls. And one of the benefits of the calls is, although the work is delegated to the Anglican Consultative Council to sort of streamline more and put into actionable items, if that's even possible, one of the benefits of the larger conversations together was talking about implementation of such calls in our own contexts and starting to understand each other in our smaller groups in deeper ways. So there were real benefits on that level too.
There's a consciousness raising about different issues. Absolutely. That I think is what you're talking about, and that will affect the communion in so many ways that you may never be able to keep track of.
Absolutely. One of the pieces, and Bishop Andrew, you alluded to this with one of the bishops in your group. One of the bishops in my group, Bishop George, is in a country where it's illegal to be Christian at this time because of the government and the way things are going. And so talking about implementing the calls to mission, for example, mission is an illegal word in his country. So he cannot support the call for mission because he would be endangering his whole diocese if he's trying to encourage people to be missional. So it really is a conscientization of bringing to the front of our minds an understanding on a deeper level of what do these words actually mean? What is it we're trying to say? What are the actions that we can find different ways of expressing? And how can we pray for our siblings around the globe as they're facing some extremely different circumstances than we are?
Yeah. And how can we take that understanding and perhaps begin to apply it where we are, where our lives are changing too?
Mm-hmm.
Kevin,
Suzanne,
you
maybe I could just say a
have much
quick word.
to talk about.
Well, and maybe I could just add to the calls that the drafting committee for each of the 10 calls, 11 calls, we each began. I was asked by the Archbishop of Canterbury to be part of the drafting committee, on the drafting group, as we were called, on the human dignity call, and we began our work only in about late April or the first week of May. So we met pretty intensely for about 6 weeks. Our drafting group on human dignity was chaired wonderfully by Bishop Howard Gregory, who's the Bishop of Jamaica and the Archbishop of the West Indies. And he convened our small group, all by Zoom, of course, and we did our work in about 5 weeks. Now, it ended in a way that none of us on the drafting group expected, with a call to reaffirm Lambeth 110. And as some of our listeners tonight will know, that got pulled, and a revised call was issued the day that we arrived in the UK. We'd been working that weekend before the conference to work on the revised call, and that got published, and that was the one that was considered. But further to Bishop Andrews' point about how everything at the conference seemed to arrive at the last minute, like we really didn't have much of the documentation until we arrived. That was true about the drafting process too. We really didn't begin that in earnest until about a month and a half before the conference began. Wow.
And yet you had 2 years that were extra.
Let's not go there, Suzanne.
No. But a few things to deal with in those 2 years that no one expected. It's just it's tough organizing things like that. Thank you for that sort of basic understanding. I'm going to go, if not directly to the specific questions, but one that got raised, and I'll start with some of them. It was a question asking, does the center of the communion shift from Canterbury towards the south at this point? Did you see that happening? Did you see evidence of that happening? Anybody?
It feels like that's a live question with the change in monarch as well. Like, we are in a time where this question needs to be asked.
Yeah, there is one of the wonderful things about the conference is that you see face to face the Anglican Communion, and a shift certainly in the global South, and the sheer size of growth in the global South compared to the North and the West. And a real sense that the Anglican expression of Christianity is shifting around the world. And so is the center still Canterbury, or is it Lagos? It's hard to know. I think there's a real want for the church to be unified, and that the instruments of unity are in many ways, or instruments of communion are very much alive and present. Certainly, I come away from the conference feeling like the West and the North needs to shift our attention mostly to the South, to do our learning and listening in a way that we perhaps have not in the past, which I think is a real gift and a shift.
I think the Archbishop of Canterbury has done a good job about in some ways, I think steering the Anglican community is like steering the Titanic. Maybe not the Titanic. Maybe that's a bad analogy.
Try another
Steering
metaphor.
a very large ship on the ocean, because like the change is so incremental. When we think about a church with our historical and theological roots and our diversity across 165 countries and all of the different languages, I mean, the change seems to happen incrementally. I think the fact that Archbishop Josiah is a Nigerian archbishop is just concluding his term as the Secretary General of the Communion, and Bishop Anthony Pogo, who is a South Sudanese bishop, is now stepping into that role. I think having new voices, new leaders from different parts of the communion in prominent leadership positions in the church, and hopefully someday the Archbishop of Canterbury, him or herself, or the Archbishop of York, him or herself. I think we're beginning to see that, but it can't just be tokenism, and I don't think that's what the Archbishop of Canterbury is interested in anyway. It has to be real and substantial change. But I saw signs of that. Watching in the plenary sessions and hearing the different voices of men and women, bishops and priests and lay people on the plenary stage, sharing stories about what's happening in the life of the communion, I was really encouraged by the diversity of voices. And we need more of that, though.
I want to pick up with one of the questions that was about mission, and you've indicated the challenge for some people of not even using the word. Did you have a sense of how mission is being done elsewhere? We seem to look to particularly the United Kingdom as the place where we've done our biggest learning in terms of mission. What are we missing that you saw in other countries, in other provinces of the communion?
We heard a really powerful presentation that was sort of like a case study from New Zealand of Bishop Justin down there, talking about how there's this sense of moving from ministering to those who are like us and familiar to us to moving to ministering to those who are different from us. And his experience that he shared with us was about living in community and inviting people in to live in community together, people who were not of his church or of his Christian community, but people who were from the broader community, people who were different from him and from his family. And it was a microcosm of the macro, right? How do we find ways to minister to those who are different from us? And that's it's a challenge for us sometimes, because we minister to those who come to church. We minister to those who talk like us and walk like us and act like us very often. And there are many ministries that are rich, that are powerful, that minister to those who are different and other. But across the communion, there's this notion that it's a very common human thing to minister to the in crowd, right? But we know that old gem that the church is the one club that's for the outsider. It's for the one that's not a member. So there was a consistent reminder of that around the communion, hearing stories from bishops from all over the world talking about similar experiences of finding ways to get outside the walls of the church, to expand our vision, to see the other. And of course, with the ecumenical conversations and interfaith conversations, it leans into how do we see neighbor who isn't necessarily even somebody who might come to church someday? How do we treat that neighbor?
And context is so unique, and I had the Bishop of Bermuda in my small group, and they have about a dozen parishes, and then a bishop from Kenya, where a number of his priests would also be principals of schools that are church run, or administrators of a local hospital or medical unit. And the ministry is much more organic and all-encompassing for smaller communities, and not with rich resources. That everything is done on a shoelace budget, and many of the clergy are non-stipendiary. And dioceses are being birthed continually. And so the sense of context means so much when you reflect on who we have been as Canadian Anglicans, and on our own journey, and how we actually learn from those experiences now, as we look to the future. I found that really helpful, to understand just the breadth of difference.
I would
So,
add to that, may I just add one thing about mission that really stuck out for me at Lambeth was well, more broadly, our privilege, period, in Canada and North America and the global North, but even our privilege when it comes to mission. Like, I think when we engage in mission in our local context, we may be in a post-Christian culture here in Canada, but we basically we engage in mission with the resources that we have, and they're abundant and in the ways that we want. One of the bishops in my small group was from India, and it's very hard to be a Christian in India right now, very hard, and there's lots of persecution of Christians. And one of his churches was on a fairly valuable piece of property, and it was burned down overnight. And he went there the next day, and the building was essentially gone. And the local authorities said there was never, that's not your property. There was never a church there. And he said there was. I've got photos. And the people in the surrounding community who were living in some fear of the local authorities said, no, there was never a church there, because there was a desire to confiscate the land. Well, engaging in mission in a context of fear and persecution, and when the precious little that you do have is either the threat is to take it away or it's actually taken away. Wow. I really felt like I had to check my privilege in those conversations. I think I don't know anything about that. And that was a humbling thing for me, but a good thing to be reminded of how much we have, and how much we have. We cry poor a lot in the Canadian church, and around financial resources and human resources and lost opportunities and all that stuff. But my goodness, we are really blessed.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, you've led into one of the other questions, which was someone who had been hearing some, I love the word whining, about the expense of the Lambeth Conference. What is the expense, and is it worth it in your minds at a time when there could be other calls on our financial resources? Anybody?
Well, first of all, I think it is a privilege for all of us, and an honor for us to attend, and I think all three of us express our deep gratitude for the diocese sending us and being able to send us to the conference. And roughly the cost is about $10,000 per person, and that's 10,000 Canadian. And what's also important to remember is that the Canadian Church donates to the worldwide communion to send bishops from around the world who are not able to afford it, and including a number of Canadian bishops who would not be able to afford it either. And the Compass Rose Society, of which we have the Canadian chapter, gives about $500,000 towards that support to send bishops. Is it worth it? I actually think it is worth it. I think the ability to gather as many bishops from around the world face to face, to be able to be in conversation, in prayer, in worship, to be the body of Christ, to come apart from our own context, to be in a strange place, all of us together, and to be linked as a body, is priceless as far as I'm concerned. It's 12 days from my experience. It's 12 days that will continue to feed my ministry and our collective ministries in the Diocese of Toronto and beyond. And the friendships that get built and sewn and woven together over time, again, helps us understand our context. We are not an island in North America. We are not separated from each other because we happen to be in Canada. We are deeply woven together as a people of the earth. And if there was ever a time that we needed to know that even more keenly, it is right now, in being able to understand each other in context. So when I get an email or a phone call or a WhatsApp message from Bishop Michael in Madagascar, who's had the same experiences as the one you described, Bishop Kevin, of a building that was just taken by the government, just taken. You have a different appreciation for what is happening to the Christian community. And so it is a conference, and it's very expensive, but I think it's worth it.
I'm seeing the nodding heads. I just was thinking it's the best. It's the best continuing education that one could ask for you folks who are trying to lead our diocese into the future, and the future is going to be very different from the past.
It is. Yeah. There's real merit too in the collection of people together who have different theologies but continue to worship Jesus all together. And that reminder that there are broad differences, but there are many, many important similarities. And that reminds us as a diocese as well, as because we're quite an international diocese, all things considered. And it's important for us to have a bit of an understanding of some of the other contexts that people are bringing with them when they come in the doors of the churches here and when they come into the ministries that we serve.
There's another question that I'm eager to hear your answer to. What was the most challenging thing you learned anew? Aha.
Well, I think one of the most, it's not, well, I don't know if it's something I learned, but something that we experienced. I think one of the most challenging things that we experienced from time to time, especially when we gathered for the Eucharist, that there were some among us who would not receive. That was particularly painful to know that that there were some among us who felt that they could not receive the communion, and that it's a reminder, I think, to the Anglicans, the whole body, that we have healing and work to do in forming communion in a deeper way, and that we are broken, and that we need God's love and salvation, and that we can't do this work on our own. It's not something that we can manufacture, but need God's grace to help us sow accord rather than discord.
I remember that feeling, Andrew, from my times at the Consultative Council. And at that point, people were not receiving, for instance, if a woman was celebrating, as well as being people from a particular province of the church that was making these decisions or those decisions. Mm-hmm. And it's like a great gaping hole that comes in your gut when you see that happen. Yeah. So I had forgotten that feeling, but that's a learning. How about you, Kevin? What was your challenging learning?
Well, I'm gonna follow up on what Bishop Andrew was saying, because I think I felt it in a particularly keen way. I remember the day, I guess it was the first day of the conference, when the Global South group of bishops had a press conference and released this document, and it clearly said at the front that they were not going to receive communion with the bishops who were there in same-sex marriages. And you know what, for the first time in 650 people, the 7 of us who were there who were in same-sex marriages, it felt really conspicuous. I mean, it was, we had lots of support, not only from within the Canadian and American houses and others, also from bishops from around the world. But it was like Andrew said, it was a painful reminder of, there was a veneer of civility, a veneer of, hey, we're all going to get together for 12 days and, sing Kumbaya and it's going to be great. But there were other moments where it was clear that there were people not interested in gathering together around the table together. one of the encouragements, and I know the question is about the challenge, but I think this is important for me anyway. A few years ago, I went to the new bishops course in Canterbury, which involves bishops from around the world who have been newly elected or appointed. And I made some friendships there with bishops from Africa and Asia. Those relationships from 2019, those bishops were some of the people who came up to me at the Lambeth Conference 3 years later and put their arm around me and said, we stand with you, which speaks to the enduring nature of these relationships, that it's not a monolith. I mean, I was interviewed on the BBC the first night I was there, and the person with whom I was interviewed said, 75% of the Anglicans in the world, disagree with same-sex marriage. Yeah, that's true. But it's not monolithic. There are people all across the communion who have various positions on issues of sexuality and marriage. The other thing I would say about that is, if we took a straw poll and said, how many of the 85 million Anglicans around the world believe in women bishops, maybe that's less than 50%. But do we still firmly believe in women bishops in Canada? Absolutely. So this whole idea of an emerging view, I think, is one that I really hold to, that it's not a numbers game. And I think that was part of the discouragement for me, coming back to your original question, was when we play the numbers game about, most of the communion feels this way, so that must be the prevailing view, and that must be the right view. I'm not sure that's true. And I think the communion needs to continue to work on what that means for us.
Thank you. Riscylla, you were going to add a challenging one too, weren't you?
Yeah. So a couple things in response and in alignment with what Bishop Kevin was saying. I'm consistently called back to Jesus is called to the margins. He calls us to the margins. And so if there's 75% or 80% of the world leaning one way, we should be going to the margins. That's who we are as Christians. One of the challenges, and speaking of women bishops, is that our Archbishop Linda was the only woman primate.
Yeah.
That's a deep challenge to the rest of the globe, and it should continue to be. When I was there, I wore my collar every day because when I was walking with Jaina, he got mistaken for the bishop in the family, which is fine. I mean, it was kind of an honor for him, I guess, but really, it's still an automatic to assume that the man is the bishop. So that's a challenge. Another piece that Archbishop Justin said was shepherds must practice humility because we are also sheep. And so I was reminded of that, both in my own behavior and in our sense of who do we want to portray ourselves as? What is our identity as leaders in the diocese, in the communion, when we have an opportunity? Who are we? We are also sheep. So let's remember that.
Oh, these are good learnings. I want to ask you before there's some other good questions, but I do want to ask you about the big church services, the big worship possibilities. I'm as you undoubtedly all of you know, a profound extrovert. So my spiritual highs are always those events, not being in quiet small groups, although I do remember that. But I just love the singing and that sense of hugeness. Just pick one of the services that impressed you.
So Bishop Vincentia preaching at the end, having a woman preacher, that was fabulous. And Archbishop Linda helping celebrate.
Oh, lovely.
Closing service. That's a memorable time for me.
That's great.
Yeah, I was going to say experiencing Linda celebrating at the closing worship was really rich. That was profoundly moving for me. I think it was the very first hymn that we sang together, "The Church is One Foundation." And to hear the thunderous voices of 650 bishops from around the world in different languages, spouses, clergy, laity, was really profound.
Kevin?
For me, it was the music. It was just so amazing that the planners of the liturgies, especially the opening service and the closing service, really did a great job, I think, of trying to incorporate as many different voices, sounds, tempos. It was really well done, and some dancing and some. It was the diversity and all of us together in one place was just it was magical. One of the things I noticed is that I really noticed this at the closing Eucharist. The music, there were about 5 or 6 musicians. That's it. So the cathedral was full of bishops and spouses, and this beautiful music was being led by 5 or 6 people. And that was actually an encouragement for me, because back home here in the Diocese of Toronto, I mean, most of our parishes, you walk in and there's a handful of people leading the music, and that's okay. That, in fact, that's beautiful, and it was beautiful in Canterbury as well.
Well, we've got another question, and it brings me to ask, our synod, in fact, in the Diocese of Toronto, is the same size that you're describing for the whole of the Anglican Communion's Lambeth Conference. But the question is deeper than that.
Sorry, I thought that was the question. I thought we were going to comment on that.
That's Lawson mouthing off. I get a chance here on this, but the question is, what do you bring back from the process of Lambeth that could be applicable to the process of synod? And you don't have to follow what I suggested might be.
I think our synod should be 12 days.
Okay.
There's something about the length of time, I agree with you, actually, that allows relationships to build. Yeah. But other than that, since that appears to not be in the books, can you see anything that would enliven even more? Because synods are meaningful in our diocese. Like they're again, the building community, building relationships. I don't mean to demean them at all. It's to say, what have you learned that you can bring back and inject in the planning?
I don't know if synod is the perfect body to replicate what Lambeth is striving to do, because we spend so much of our time legislating. I think we can certainly expand synod by a day or two. We may have a complete revolt by the end, but it may call us to consider a different way of gathering as a diocese. Laity, clergy, and leaders in the diocese who are not necessarily elected to a particular position, but come together for prayer, for mutual support, for dreaming of the mission, for being really present with each other. One of the other things that I would add to that is that the rich diversity of culture and language that we experienced at Lambeth is here in the Diocese of Toronto. Yeah. It is, boy, oh boy. It just awakens for me the relationships that bishops and archbishops have around the world with the city and the Diocese of Toronto, and are able to pinpoint parishes where they know parishioners are a part of a long relationship. And it strikes me a real opportunity for us to be able to deepen that experience together as a community. How do we hear languages beyond English? How do we build an opportunity for us in Toronto to wear headsets so that the primary language that's being spoken from the front on a dais is a different language? That helps us understand that the context in which we minister now in the diocese is going to be very different, and it is different now, and an opportunity for us to lean into the future in a new way.
Mm-hmm. You know, there was a question, there is a question reminding us of the Anglican Congress of 1963, I think.
Yeah.
I think there's a move towards that in the communion, and I'm hearing the possibilities of it here, where we look at gathering for the sake of being and learning, as opposed to legislating.
Mhm.
How do we get that moving at both levels?
Well, it took a Canadian contingent to start the Lambeth Conference. You know, it was really the Canadian church that asked the Archbishop of Canterbury to consider beginning Lambeth. Maybe we need to start pining for a Congress as a Canadian church, and say we're calling for something new.
Because I really, being the layperson here on the panel, the unpurpled shirted person, so much of the church is missing from these discussions, and I think the togetherness is what we need to be aiming for, both across. Well, it's part of the othering, isn't it, Riscylla, that you were talking about, both across different kinds of people, but also different orders of ministry, different kinds of ministry that we are engaged in.
Something that I think that I try and remember and call myself to remember too is that, yes, Lambeth is definitely an exclusive gathering when it's got the bishops, but the bishops are all formed out of the lay people, and their ministry has been with lay people as well as with clergy. They have served as clergy, and now they're serving in a different role as a leader. And they bring all that experience, that wealth of experience with them. And the ministry that we all do is with each other. So although the others aren't all there in the same capacity, unless you consider spouses who were there and did have a part to inform us with, it's not completely exclusive. It's not like we're living in a bubble. So I just want to mention that too.
That's a good point. I
was really encouraged by the talk at Lambeth of gathering people together again in a Congress-like way, whether it's another official Anglican Congress like we hosted here in Toronto 50 years ago, 60 years ago, or something different. And our primate said a couple of times during Lambeth, remember, these are just 650 bishops of the communion. Like there are 80 or 85 million Anglicans in the world. And this is just 650 of us in the conference. And yep, we're bishops, but we're missing most of the communion. So I really welcome opportunities for people coming together. The other thing I would say about it is, at least at Lambeth, and this is just my own view, I think the days of Lambeth being a place where resolutions are passed is over. At least I hope it's over. I mean, I think coming back to Bishop Andrew's comment about our own diocesan synod, obviously it's important that we have decisions that are being made about budget and mission and ministry. And we need to, have a process. After experiencing 12 days of Lambeth, I hope that we're never going back to the days of, resolutions on sexuality or resolutions on anything. The sense of an emerging consensus around different themes, you could just feel the Holy Spirit moving in the room. When we put the clickers away, when we stopped raising our hands for votes, when we stopped shouting yes or shouting no, and just let the Holy Spirit lead, I think we're in a good place coming out of Lambeth without any of those votes. And I hope that's going to be the way forward.
Thank you. That's positive, hopeful stuff that you're talking about, all of you. It seems to me, however, we may need a resolution to go forward to get the revolution to happen. You've actually lit the fire under me to begin some of that. But there was a good question on the list that was provided to us, asking about your own experience of God's grace in a particular incident or gathering or topic, and how you're going to bring that awareness, that new awareness of God's grace that you got at that time, into your life now. This is getting quite personal, so you can The first one to say, put the hand up or ready to go. Okay, there she is. Riscylla, you start off and the other two will have a chance to think about that.
So I will start by saying there were many moments of grace for me that rose to the surface. And as I reflect, they continue to rise to the surface. But one in particular was an invitation to recall, and that moment of recollection of who first shared the gospel with me. How did I first hear the good news that actually changed my heart and changed my mind and helped me to understand and see in a new way? And so I was reflecting on that. I was thinking about my confirmation teacher, and I was thinking about people who in my childhood church helped raise me up and teach me. And it was really a profound moment of grace where I was thinking to myself, this is our call in discipleship, is to walk with one another and to share how our hearts were changed, how it actually spoke to us in the first place. Because for me now, the gospel continues to speak to me every day. But recalling that particular early moment was very powerful for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Who's going next?
Well, why don't I jump in, Kevin? I like Bishop Riscylla. There were many, many moments of feeling God's presence and God's grace. One moment was in the middle of kind of the open space just outside of our venue. One morning, crossing paths with Bishop Ebenezer from Grahamstown. And we just happened to see each other, and we started a conversation about context in ministry. And he said, I've just been so used to working hard in a parish as a parish priest, and as a bishop, I wrestle with the failings and the surprises and the successes of the church, and so much of that is a difficult weight to carry, because as a priest, I just had to worry about what I was doing from one Sunday to the next in my small context, and what he was saying to me just resonated, for some reason, just resonated so deeply. And for some unknown reason, we just held hands together and we both leaned in to each other where our heads met for a moment, forehead to forehead. And we just held that moment for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then we parted. And you couldn't have scripted it. It was just one of those tender meetings in the middle of a group of people, and a recognition, I think, for both of us of, on the one hand, the honor of being called to be a bishop and the weight of it too.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Kevin. A story of, like the other two bishops, so many moments of grace, so many, hard to even remember them all, let alone recount them. One that was particularly poignant for me was, as you know, my spouse was not invited to the conference, but one morning he was invited with some of the other same-sex spouses to meet with spouses of bishops from the global south. So the 6 of them, 3 and 3, facilitated by folks who were organizing the conference. They had to consent, of course, and all 6 of them agreed, and they sat in a room together for a couple of hours in the morning. 3 same-sex spouses, 3 spouses of bishops from the global south, and they just talked. And Mohan said to me afterwards, those couple of hours have changed me forever. Anyway, one of the things that happened was he was in a conversation with a woman named Honey, and Honey is the wife of Bishop Leo from Pakistan. And Bishop Leo and I got to know each other at the conference, and we were talking a little bit about our respective ministry fields, not a whole lot about our personal lives. And meanwhile, Mohan and Honey were getting to know each other somewhere else on campus. And the day that we went to Lambeth Palace in London, the 4 of us just happened to walk through the gate together, Mohan and I, and Bishop Leo and his wife, Honey. And Honey and Mohan hugged because they'd met before. And it was clear to me that the penny totally dropped for Bishop Leo. He's like, oh, wait a sec. This is the guy I've been talking to. He's actually one of those bishops that's married to another man, and he's hugging my wife, honey. And the four of us just stood and talked for a couple of minutes, and we embraced, and then we left. And I don't know if it changed Bishop Leo and honey, but it sure changed me and Mohan, and I'll never forget that.
Oh, these are wonderful stories, folks. Really wonderful. Can I share with you, out of my experience, one thing that I know will now happen to you? The connection around the globe. When there was a fire, the wildfires in Australia a few years ago, I did a quick 1 or 2 liner to the primate who had been at my study table at the last consultative council meeting, just to say, I have no idea what it is like to lead your diocese, to lead your church through this chaos. I'm with you and I'm praying with you. And when I think of the floods in Pakistan, I think of Bishop Humphrey. They're just, and I don't do WhatsApp yet, but I struggle with that one. But I do know that the one-liner is just a connection right across the globe that helps you understand the world better. Well, there are so many crises, you can't face them all. But if you have a face on the person who's trying to lead a diocese through that mess, whatever that mess is, or that joy even.
And it helps us too, right? Because we also hear from those bishops across the globe as they connect in with us and say, hi, how are you doing?
Yeah.
Praying for you today.
Can I also add, Suzanne, one of the other surprising things I think for us going to Lambeth is that the Canadian house became closer. I would say 2/3, if not more, of the Canadian house has changed since 2019. And many of us have not spent enough time together in person. And sometimes it means going away in order to actually connect with each other in a different way and to connect with spouses as well. I think we came home from Lambeth, actually, a tighter group.
That will have long run effects. That 12 days investment away will enrich the relationships that are so important in our country as well. And you certainly can see that. I'm coming to close to the end of my questions, so I've got a couple real zingers here. So hope you've got them. So I want from each of you, if possible, a nugget of wisdom that you brought home and you're going to act on it. Not just that's in your head, but somehow you're going to be responsible for acting on it in some way. I think we can allow you a moment's quiet to think that one through if you.
I'm very simply, we are better together.
And communication is key. Reaching out to one another is vital.
And I would add that ours is a gospel of reconciliation. The theme of reconciliation there and bringing that home to our own context in all kinds of different ways is something that that's a nugget I will definitely bring into my own ministry.
I'm interested in that one in particular, Kevin, because as you know, the Anglican Communion has as its organizing principles, and this was a resolution passed at the Consultative Council, what is called the marks of mission. And at the last meeting I was at, the Canadian Church brought forward an additional phrase, and I'm just going to read it. To seek to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and here's the bit, and to pursue peace and reconciliation. Now, we didn't come with those exact words, but we knew we had to, out of our experience of working at healing and reconciliation for so long with Indigenous people, and knowing how long and how hard that will be ahead. We needed to bring that to the communion, and it's I think the only change that's been made in those marks of mission for years, so that reconciliation, as your perspective, and one that we all try to live, is really important. So we got the nuggets of wisdom, and now an image, a picture that you can leave with us. Just one, a picture that you can paint for us, that helps us feel that we were almost there, even if we're only priests and deacons and lay people, and maybe some other bishops thrown in for good measure. An image. What picture comes to your mind?
So for me, from Amos chapter 8, a basket of summer fruit. It was hot. It was sweet. We were all different, but we were all together.
Nice.
For me, too many to name, but one for tonight. The picture of all the women bishops together was powerful. To see the shift to almost 100 at Lambeth this year.
Andrew, we missed a few words of what you were saying. To see the shift.
Just to see the change, the shift from just a small gathering in 2008 to almost 100 in 2022. I've found that profound. In fact, I've got a picture. I bought a picture of it for the diocesan office. It'll get framed and put in to one of our meeting rooms.
If I may, two. If I may, the first, because I was only going to say one, but after what
Well,
Bishop
that's
Andrew,
not fair. You get two.
After what Bishop Andrew just said, I can't let this go without saying something about it. The fact that 14 years ago, the only openly gay partnered bishop was not even invited to the conference, and 8 of us standing in a formal picture on the last day who are out partnered. Part of the LGBTQ community, and to be a part of standing alongside those 7 colleagues was wonderful. And I pray that number, like the number of women bishops, is only going to continue to increase. The image that I came though with when you asked the question a moment ago was we in the plenary hall the whole time was a wonderful picture of the world, the globe. And actually the part that we saw was Canada. The whole 12 days, it focused on the Northern Hemisphere and Canada. So people in the global South probably weren't very happy about that. But there was a slice of Canadiana on the front. But the words, God's church for God's world, which was the theme of the conference, constantly calling us back to remember God's church for God's world, not our church, not our world, God's church for God's world.
At the same time, maybe we are still called to be the designated driver some way or other.
That's a great image.
Well, this has been wonderful. I've had a good time. And I hope the people who've been watching and providing comments and questions have learned a lot. You've been very helpful, and it won't be the end of the questions to you about the Lambeth Conference, but what a good start to some conversations that we'll have when you come and visit us, or when we're at committee meetings with you, or when we just think of you, or when maybe we should start sending WhatsApps to you or whatever. But I think the way to end, if we could ask all that are at home with us, and us to conclude with the doxology, and really understand that God's glory got a good run at the Lambeth Conference, and you live with God's grace and with our support as you attempt to move back home and bring the best of what you learned and experienced and felt of God's grace. So let's say it together. Glory to God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or
imagine.
Glory to God from generation
To generation.
in the
the
church
church
and
and
in
in
Christ
Christ Jesus.
forever and ever.
forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
And as we say,
Hallelujah.
thank you to Jennifer and Martha, who've been behind the scenes making it all work. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.